Ocean acidification of New Jersey's ocean and coastal waters. My name is Marjorie Kaplan, and I'm the Associate Director of Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague Jean Herb of the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I also co-direct the newly established New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. Other than today's presenters, Megan Rutkowski, Grace Saba, and Janine Barr, and our Rutgers team, you are all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, you would hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen and a series of circles will be displayed. There's one circle that looks like a dialog bubble, and if you click that, the chat comes up and you can type your questions there. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat box throughout this morning's presentation. Please type into the box that's called All Panelists. We are monitoring the questions as they come in, and after the formal presentations, we will address as many of your questions as time allows. We are recording today's webinar, and we will alert you to its availability. For those of you who were not on any of our previous webinars, I'd like to give you a quick overview about the newly formed Climate Change Resource Center for New Jersey. It's housed here at Rutgers University. It was created by legislation signed by Governor Murphy just this past January to create and support the use of impartial and actionable science to advance government, public, private, and non-governmental sector efforts to adapt to and mitigate a changing climate. The center is intended to conduct applied research, create planning tools, develop technical guidance, undertake pilot projects, and provide practical support for addressing climate change here in New Jersey. The center also has part of its mission to connect actionable research to policymakers, planners, practitioners, the media, community, students, and other individuals through outreach, training, and education. And so in keeping with that mission, we are really pleased to present today's webinar by a great constellation of scientists, Megan Rutkowski, Grace Saba, and Janine Barr. I will just briefly let you know about each one of them. Megan Rutkowski is an environmental specialist with the State of New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. She's worked under several coastal offices and bureaus, and most recently the Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning. Her area of focus is the science behind resilience planning, particularly in regard to ocean issues. And she's currently leading the department's efforts to research and develop an ocean acidification action plan for New Jersey, acting as bureau representative at Mid-Atlantic Coastal Acidification Network, known as MACON, meetings, and at other Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, MARCO, work groups, and keeping apprised of climate and ocean acidification science research updates for the Bureau. Dr. Grace Saba is an assistant professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers, as one of the faculties in the Rutgers University Center for Ocean Observing and Leadership, also known as the RU Cool Group. She also serves as the Ocean Acidification Innovation Lead for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Association Coastal Ocean Observing System, known as MARICOOS. In this role, Dr. Saba serves on the Steering Committee and Science Working Group on the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Acidification Network. And I wouldn't be shy to tell you that I think Dr. Saba has been one of the leading forces in developing the network. Her broad research interests are in the fields of coastal marine organismal ecology and physiology, with an emphasis on how organisms interact with their environment and other organisms, how physiological processes impact biogeochemistry, and how climate change impacts these processes. And last but not least is Janine Barr, who's a graduate student working with Dr. Daphne Monroe in Rutgers Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences, focusing on the coastal ecology of oyster farms and assessing the ecosystem services this form of aquaculture may provide. Her presentation will also include relevant policy and management considerations informed by experiences in the Rutgers Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience Program. Before I turn it over to Megan, just a quick reminder, remember to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as possible during the Q&A session. And with that, it's my pleasure to invite Megan Rutkowski to turn on her video and audio and commence. Thank you.
All right, hi, I'm Megan Rutkowski. I'm with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's fairly recently established Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning. Today, I just want to give a pretty quick background on where the state is in our ocean acidification planning and where we would like to go moving forward. All right, so a lot of the climate related materials and progress you've seen recently coming out of the state has come from, Executive Order 89, which was signed by Governor Murphy in October of last year. So this, among many other things, directed us to write a scientific report on climate change and also a climate change resilience strategy and a comprehensive coastal resilience plan. So in the realm of ocean acidification, those of us that work in that area have a couple of goals, the first of which was ensuring that ocean acidification science made its way into our scientific report on climate change. And then after that, we wanted to make sure that New Jersey started on the path down to writing our own ocean acidification action plan, and that the directive to do that made its way into the climate resilience strategy. So at the same time as this was going on in New Jersey, elsewhere in most other coastal states, most states are either writing or have written their own ocean acidification action plans. So moving forward, we are hoping to learn from them. All right, so next, our first objective was met. The first scientific report on climate change for the state of New Jersey was released on our webpage. Our web address is right there. And this was released on our webpage just this past June. And it does have its own ocean acidification section that was as up to date in the science as we could possibly make it with the research at the time. Going forward, our scientific report is going to be updated at least every 2 years. So this will allow us to fill in any research gaps that we've identified as new information comes to light. So moving forward with our goals after this, those of us here working in OA under the umbrella of the New Jersey Coastal Management Plan, the Bureaus of Climate Resilience Planning, the Office of Policy and Coastal Management, and the Bureau of Marine Water Monitoring together have formed New Jersey's ocean acidification team. Now, this team has reached out to engage with the New Jersey Climate Change Research Center at Rutgers in order to gain a few specific insights. The first is filling in some of our knowledge gaps that we have identified in our science report, but also in reaching out to the states that have already started writing their own ocean acidification action plans so we can learn how they went about this, what worked for them, what didn't, and lastly, in helping us to outline the elements that New Jersey can use as we go along in writing our own and first ocean acidification action plan. So ultimately, our goal here in New Jersey is to marry the science from the research in our scientific report with the lessons from the other coastal states that have come before us in writing their ocean acidification action plans in order to inform the path going forward in writing our very own first ocean acidification action plan. That's it. So thank you. I will now turn it over to the much more interesting presentations on science.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan, for that great introduction. I'm going to invite Professor Grace Saba to turn on her video and audio, and she'll talk a bit more about the science of ocean acidification.
Okay. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure the technical difficulties before. Okay, thanks for having me, and thank you, Megan, for the starting off and kind of explaining the reason for us presenting today. And thank you for the nice introduction, Marjorie. Okay, so my focus of what I'm going to present today is kind of the science behind oceanification, specifically how it is and could be impacting New Jersey's ocean and coastal waters. So I'm going to just start with a primer on ocean acidification for those of you that may not be so familiar with what that is. So essentially, the Earth has a natural greenhouse effect, which in this picture is in sort of equilibrium. So plants actually absorbed carbon dioxide or CO2 in the process of photosynthesis. And then animals respire CO2, so they release CO2 into the atmosphere, and the oceans actually absorb CO2. So it's a nice equilibrium that we have going on in this picture. And the oceans are really important in the carbon cycle because of the exchange of carbon dioxide that they have with the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide, as most people know, is a greenhouse gas in that it absorbs heat. So actually, it's good for the Earth. It makes it habitable, makes it able for us to live in. But too much of it is not a good thing. So what's happened since the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, is that there's been a lot of excess carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere through combustion of fossil fuels, land use changes, and cement production, which kind of throws off the balance, and that the ocean is now absorbing more of that carbon dioxide, and there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to warm the planet. So the first problem with carbon dioxide, or too much carbon dioxide, is that it warms the Earth. And then the second problem is actually what we call ocean acidification. So it's driven by the ocean's absorption of that increasing carbon dioxide, which causes there's this complex set of chemical reactions that occurs that eventually acidifies the ocean or makes it more acidic. So I can't really talk about ocean acidification without talking about the chemistry behind it. So when the ocean absorbs CO2, it interacts with the seawater and it forms a carbonic acid. And then that acid is dissociated into what we call bicarbonate. So here, and carbonate, and it releases these hydrogen ions. I hope you can see my cursor here. It releases these hydrogen ions, which drives the decrease in pH. So that's the measure of acidity in the ocean. But the ocean is comprised mainly of these bicarbonate ions. So the seawater is composed primarily of bicarbonate. So what happens is the excess hydrogen ions will bind with carbonate ions to form bicarbonate. And what happens is you lose carbonate ions in that buffering process. And this is important because a lot of organisms use calcium carbonate. So they build their shells and their structures with calcium carbonate in this process called calcification. Whereby if you have a lot of carbonate ions, you have a supersaturation of carbonate ions. And this is called the omega here, the symbol here. And that value is greater than 1. So that's when it's supersaturated with respect to carbonate ions, an organism can freely form their structures made out of calcium carbonate. Whereas if this carbonate ion is not in abundance, it's undersaturated with respect to carbonate ions. So this omega value is less than 1. It makes it really difficult for organisms to form their shells, or they have to use more energy to form their shells, and then there's less energy towards things like reproduction and growth. So this is one of the major direct impacts of ocean acidification on the organisms. And we care about that because especially in New Jersey, we get things like scallops and oysters that form their shells out of calcium carbonate, but there's all sorts of organisms that do that in the marine system. So corals, planktonic pteropods are another example shown in these photos, but there are several organisms that use calcium carbonate. So that's the main concern biologically with ocean acidification, but can also impact several other physiological processes, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But the important thing I want you to pull from this, because I'll be referring to these parameters later, is when you have excess carbon dioxide, you get a lower pH in the seawater and a lower saturation state for calcium carbonate, and that's this omega symbol. So what have the trends been? So this is what we call the Keeling curve. It's a measure of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, and the units here are parts per million volumes, parts per million, which means that it's the amount of carbon dioxide per million volumes of seawater. And so you can see this is a record going up to present. I took this picture of this one yesterday. Let me see if I can move my video so I can actually see my screen there. Okay. So you can see, a pretty rapid increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide since about 1950, as we call kind of the hockey stick. So this is what we're concerned about, is the rate of acidification, or the rate of CO2 in the atmosphere. I'll get to the acidification part later. But, oops, I can't advance. There we go. And so I just highlight this box because the next slide is going to focus on this time range. And that's this slide here. So the red line here is the atmospheric carbon dioxide that's increasing rapidly and for this time period, 1958. But then we've also had some seawater sampling now at Station Aloha, right off the coast of Hawaii. Here is where the carbon dioxide atmospheric concentrations are measured, the station Mauna Loa. But we've had monthly sampling now at Station Aloha in the ocean since about, I think it's 1988, 1989. And so you can see the green is actually the concentration of carbon dioxide in seawater, and the blue is pH. So you can see that with increasing atmospheric CO2, you get increasing concentration of CO2 in the ocean, and then resulting in lower pH. So this is a trend that's been happening. It's a relatively constant rate of change. But since the 1800s, it's been about a 40% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide since then, which is equivalent to a drop of 0.1 pH units, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually it's equivalent to a 28% increase in ocean acidity. The rate of change is really what we're most concerned about, and the rate of change it's 10 times faster than anything experienced over the past 50 million years. So it's a very rapid rate of change. And this is expected to continue. It's projected to double. The atmospheric carbon dioxide is projected to double by 2100, which is equivalent to a drop of 0.2 to 0.3 pH units, and that's equivalent to 100 to 150% increase in ocean acidity since the Industrial Revolution. So it's a pretty rapid rate of change, and it's ongoing, and these trends are happening globally. So while New Jersey is experiencing the same rate of global change, we're also subject to the different water masses that interact off our coastal ocean. So I wanted to show you this as an example. So these colors represent values of that omega value, so that saturation state value. And you can see this when you have, go to the next slide, there you go. So the warm, salty, well-buffered Gulf Stream water is in these like oranges and yellows. So they're high in salinity, they're well-buffered, so they're pretty high in pH and omega. Whereas these waters coming from the north, this Labrador sea slope water coming from the north, is cold, it has high CO2, it's weakly buffered, so it typically has lower pH and lower omega values. So right in New Jersey here, we see this kind of interaction between these two water masses. So it's going to cause a lot of variability in our system. And I will say, so the blue values go from 0.5 to about 2. While they're not all below 1, some organisms still start responding negatively to values even as high as 3 omega. So there is concern there. even if that value is not less than 1. I meant to say that earlier. But anyway, so you can see the interplay of these water masses will cause variability in our system in New Jersey. But so I've talked mainly about the traditional ocean acidification, which is caused by the anthropogenic CO2 in the ocean. But we also have a lot of local drivers in our nearshore system that can cause high variability and extremes in pH and carbon dioxide and saturation state. And that's due to a combination of natural anthropogenic impacts and also just the unique processes in our coastal ocean. So the first one, well, with respect to the traditional ocean acidification, in addition to that, we have a lot of fresh water coming into our system. And fresh water is typically, it's low in salinity and low in alkalinity, which means it has less ability to buffer changes in pH. So it can cause the system to become low in pH pretty quickly, especially when you get a lot of input. We also have runoff, which brings in nutrients, and those nutrients cause productivity, so an increase in productivity. And so that is good in the surface because organisms can eat that, and it feeds up, up through the trophic levels. It provides sustainability for the ecosystem. But if there's too much, what happens is once they die out, they'll sink to the bottom and they'll be respired by bacteria, which then releases a bunch of carbon dioxide in the bottom waters. And so you can get ocean acidification in the bottom waters pretty quickly and pretty intensely in cases where you get a big bloom of these phytoplankton in the surface waters. And then we also have upwelling, which is caused by from wind-driven shifts in the surface current, where the surface currents move offshore and you get this deep water that comes up near shore. And it's those deep bottom waters that typically have lower pH and higher CO2. So there's a lot of very unique local drivers that can cause episodic episodes of acidification. And in New Jersey, with all the fresh water coming in, and we have summer upwelling events, and we have a lot of productivity off the shelf, we're subject to pretty much all of those drivers, and they are highly variable. So I just wanted to show some examples and give you kind of glimpse of what seasonal patterns are off of our coastal shelf. And so this is our, we have a new glider, the development of a new pH sensor with Seabird Scientific and our Rutgers group here to look at the seasonal cycles of carbonate chemistry off of our shelf. And we've been able to run transects off here and here. And so this is the seasonal data derived from those glider transects. And the great part of the benefit of the gliders is that it gives you vertical information. So we can see what the dynamics are throughout the whole water column, which is really important, especially with respect to what I just talked to you about, where you can get acidification in bottom waters. And so you can see, highly variable differences in the seasons, where, if you're looking at, this is pH, so the blues are lower and the yellows are higher. In the summertime, we see the most significant drops in pH in the bottom waters here. But we also see some unique patterns where near shore, like here in the spring, we had a heavy precipitation event. So you can see the runoff effect of the fresh water impacting pH. And then we also had in the spring and summer, we get high phytoplankton biomass, and phytoplankton is a plant in the ocean, and they'll absorb that CO2. So actually you'll see an increase in pH right where the phytoplankton are. So you can kind of see that signal here in the spring and then the summer. And then the fall, we get some influence of that Gulf Stream water that I showed you earlier. We get that warm, salty, buffered seawater coming onto the shelf that actually kind of alleviates acidification in those areas. And these are areas where the Atlantic sea scallop lives and spawns during that time of year. So it could be an important impact on their life cycle and spawning. So we're starting to now look at how these seasonal cycles kind of pair and are linked with the biology of the organisms, so we can kind of inform how they might be impacted seasonally. So I talked a lot about calcification with respect to that's the main process that's directly impacted by ocean acidification, but there are several other processes now that are coming to light that are negatively impacted by acidification in organisms. And this figure here is showing a meta-analysis of several studies that looked at these different processes in organisms, in marine organisms, and how they're impacted by acidification. And what this is really showing, it's the mean effect size, which is it's the log transformed response ratio, which means it's the difference from the mean. So the mean response is the 0. Anything below that is a negative response. So you can see that in a lot of these processes, you get negative responses by the organisms when they're exposed to ocean acidification conditions. And then this just covers some processes, but now with new science and research, we're seeing impacts on other things like reproduction, olfactory, so their sense of smell, behavior, swimming ability, and then those in turn can impact ecosystem level things, which we're just starting to get to through things like ecosystem models. And we still don't have a lot of information on how these organisms are how they're able to acclimate or how they're able to adapt, and if they're able to adapt. So, but there's a lot of ongoing research to start getting at those questions. Specifically for the Mid-Atlantic, we did a review study where we kind of looked at all of the studies focused on Mid-Atlantic species, and this is kind of a quick look at what we saw. So we compiled data from reviewing impacts of acidification on these species. There were 18 species, all different types of groups from 59 studies. And a lot of these species were managed by the Fisheries Management Councils, or NOAA, or the states, and consisted of a wide range of response variables, so reproduction, metabolism, growth, things like that. So as you can see just from this pie chart is that most of the organisms responded negatively to acidification conditions. Only a little bit, 5% responded positively, and those were the plants. So things like submerged aquatic vegetation, they actually like the CO2 increase because they can use less energy to convert CO2 to their organic carbon forms that they use for energy. So, and then we do see some no effects. But what we did see in all the studies is that there's a lot of variability between species, but also within species and how they respond to acidification. So we've realized that it's important to keep conducting these studies to gain more information. So why do we care about this? Obviously, we care about the organisms, but the organisms are important to us culturally, but also economically. So, effects of oceanification can lead through biological changes in the organisms, but then socioeconomic impacts, which are now leading to management actions and policy, which Megan highlighted, and then I'll highlight a little bit here. And I'm going to go through one example. So ocean acidification really came to light in the mid-2000s because they were starting to see die-offs in the oyster hatcheries. And so in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to kind of run through this example for you. So in the Pacific Northwest, they experienced this upwelling of acidic water, which I described before. And here's an image of what that looks like vertically. So this is the coastline here. And when we get the winds that blow the surface water offshore, you get this deep water that then comes onto shore. And the deep water in the Pacific Northwest is very low in pH and high in CO2. So it causes these coastal acidification events. And what happened in 2007 and 2008 was that a lot of these hatcheries were heavily impacted by an ocean acidification event. They had an 80% decrease in oyster production in those 2 years. Taylor Shellfish Farms was one of them, and they provide a lot of the oyster larvae and spat to hatcheries and aquaculture centers along the entire West Coast. So it had multi-state impacts. But this is an image of so they realized something was going on. They thought maybe it was something to do with the water that they were bringing into their facility. And so when they paired with some researchers, they collaborated with some researchers to start looking at what was going on. And they did see that when they took water from the shallow intake line, which had a higher pH, this is your average ocean pH, the larvae were fine. But when they took water from their deep intake line with a much lower pH, they started to see these deformed shells and much lower survival. So they linked these die-offs to acidification. And once they did that, there was kind of a panic within the industry. Made a lot of headlines, and the industry became pretty concerned. And so there was some panic, but then they started adapting. So I got the slide from Bill Dewey, who runs Taylor Shellfish Farms. But they ramped up research and monitoring at their hatcheries. They started expanding larval production in Hawaii. So they actually kind of moved some of their locations there. And then they started treating hatchery rearing water to basically buffer the lower pH. And then they're starting to undergo research, as well as other places are doing this, to start breeding OA resistant oysters. So there was a lot of adaptation that these industries started to do because of those events. And that also led to they basically pushed a need for policy actions. And so this really started in the state of Washington following those die-off events, where the governor convened an ocean acidification blue ribbon panel to address the effects of OA on their shellfish resources. And this happened in 2012. And then they developed the first state OA action plan that Megan had referred to before. And then this became a region-wide impact, so a multi-state impact between Washington, Oregon, and California, called the Pacific Coast Collaborative, because they were all impacted by this problem. And so that kind of started the policy side in the U.S. with respect to ocean acidification. And several other U.S. states have followed suit now. So New York State, for instance, has started their ocean acidification task force to form their ocean acidification action plan. As Megan mentioned before, many states started joining the OA Alliance. And they're coming up now with their ocean acidification action plans. There's bipartisan support for ocean acidification specific bills that are currently in the House committee. And then there's been a lot of work to establish these regional acidification networks that are meant to inform stakeholders and researchers on the state of acidification in those specific regions. So MACAN was, as an example, because that's the one in the Mid-Atlantic now. So a lot of work being done now. So, and Megan had talked about how NJDEP is now recognizing these OA risks, and they included this statement in the science report on climate change that just came out in June. So they're recognizing the risks of OA here because of the dependence on the shellfish harvests. And there was a study in 2015 that was looking specifically at social vulnerability. And so we're right here, and we're in the reds. And we're in the reds because, and that means high social vulnerability. And we're in the reds because of essentially our dependence on these shell fisheries. And so while we may not see impacts here in our state until after 2100, we need to be prepared. So that it was good to see this in the study and linking the impacts on the organisms to economy and social vulnerability. So we know that we're going to be vulnerable because of our dependence on these shell fisheries. Here's just kind of a summary of of other reasons why we could be at risk and we should be prepared. And that's that New Jersey's commercial fishing industry is the 5th largest in the United States. It provides a lot of jobs. The fishing and aquaculture industries contribute more than $1 billion annually to the state's economy. And then a lot of our commercial important species are shellfish. So Atlantic sea scallop, ocean quahog, Atlantic surf clam, blue crabs, and eastern oyster. But we also have a lot of regionally important commercially and recreationally finfish in the region. And we're just now starting to get some information on how they're impacted by ocean acidification. But we do have a lot of gaps. So in the study in the review that we did that came out last year, we did see that there were several species. So out of the 35 managed species in our region, 69% haven't been investigated yet for acidification impacts. So that's a pretty large proportion of important species that we have no idea how they could respond to ocean acidification. So we know that we have gaps that need to be addressed. So this is kind of a summary of what our research needs are for New Jersey. And that's to continue doing these studies to look at the potential impacts of various life stages, acclimation, adaptation potential thresholds of acidification, impacts on the food web and community structure. But there's also several other things that we should be doing and we should do in the future, and that's continue and expand the research on genetics for the OA resistant species for breeding, mitigation strategies for aquaculture facilities. So while we may not see direct impacts now, we may in the future, just like Washington State did. So it'd be good to figure out how best we could be prepared for that. And then also connecting the organisms and ecosystem responses to ecosystem services. So for observations, this is a map showing ongoing observations we have for ocean acidification. And while it looks like it's well covered, there's a lot of spatial and temporal gaps here. So for instance, a lot of these cruises only happen once every 4 years. There's now a cruise that fortunately is happening seasonally, and that's in the New York Bight. We have gliders now that we can use seasonally for observations. And then we have a lot of stations inshore looking at pH in our rivers and estuaries. So, but there are a lot of gaps. For one, we may not have high enough sample frequency to look at changes over time, or even short-term episodic changes that could be really important to organisms. Typically, a lot of these measurements only measure pH, which gives us an idea of pH, but we can't calculate saturation state from just pH. We have to measure like carbon dioxide as well, or total alkalinity, or another parameter of the carbonate system to really understand how ocean acidification, what the dynamics of ocean acidification are. I mentioned this briefly before, but we don't have a lot of depth profiling measurements. And then we're monitoring cross the salinity gradient. We need to do that a little better to get our rivers and estuaries. We need to observe OA with other stressors because, as we know, there's also other things going on. So we're getting temperatures are warming. We could have areas with low dissolved oxygen that could be combined with ocean acidification and impact organisms worse or perhaps even better. So it kind of depends. So, but we need to be observant with looking at how ocean acidification interacts with other stressors. Kind of in summary for this, we know that New Jersey would benefit from a comprehensive statewide monitoring network that can cohesively act to address observation needs. So I know we would highlight, if and when we develop an ocean acidification action plan for New Jersey, we would highlight that would be one of the first needs for the state. So that is all I have, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end, but let's transfer this to Janine.
Great. Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Grace. Janine, I'm going to invite you to turn your camera on and get started.
Okay, great. I'm just pulling up my PowerPoint. Okay. Can everybody hear and see me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and it's great to be with Marjorie, Carrie, Megan, and Grace today. I'm really excited about the opportunity to speak with you all, and I'm going to be talking about ocean acidification and the importance of stakeholder engagement. So just as a quick overview, I'll be covering three main points in this world. First, I'll be sharing my thoughts on why stakeholder engagement is important for any state's ocean acidification work. Second, I'll be sharing some examples of how other states have succeeded in integrating stakeholder engagement into their own ocean acidification initiatives. And lastly, I'll provide an overview of the project I've been working on to help prepare New Jersey's coastal management program for their future OA stakeholder engagement work. So what I'll be talking about at the end of my presentation is the work I've been doing this summer with Grace, Jean, Herb, and Megan as part of a larger OA collaboration between Rutgers, New Jersey's coastal management program, and NJDEP's OA team. So first up, the importance of stakeholder engagement. Engaging stakeholders is important for any environmental issue, and ocean acidification is no exception. First, engaging stakeholders helps to create a more robust and meaningful OA initiative for any coastal state. So this is because stakeholders can provide a range of expertise and local knowledge that may help inform OA research needs or mitigation actions in the state. We've heard from Megan and Grace about the impact that OA has on New Jersey and its marine organisms. So we know that OA affects many stakeholder groups like those that are seen on this slide. So up top, we have commercial and recreational fishermen, as well as commercial aquaculturemen. The processing plants that package and ship seafood to market, and even the charter boat captains who would rely on healthy fish populations to earn their living off the coast. All these sectors would be impacted directly by OA, and indirectly, there are many other sectors that would be impacted. So places like restaurants, seafood industry reps, local government reps of communities that are economically and socially dependent on the shellfish industry or other vulnerable species like some finfish. Each stakeholder group comes with their own set of experiences and knowledge that should be shared and definitely considered when deciding how to address OA in any state. So the second reason why engaging stakeholders is important is that it improves the implementation of an OA initiative. Creating an OA initiative that looks good on paper is an incredible first step, but it is also important for that initiative to be implementable. By engaging stakeholder groups early and often in the OA initiative process, both stakeholder groups and the states would benefit. Stakeholder groups will be more invested in any state action items because they were actively engaged in the creation of those action items. And likewise, the state would be able to complete those action items in a more timely manner because of the support and on-the-ground knowledge provided by those stakeholder groups. So it's a win-win situation. Of note, though, is that stakeholder engagement is not a one-way street. It's not just about educating decision makers responsible for executing the OA initiative. It is equally important to educate impacted stakeholders, especially those who may not be as engaged, aware, or interested right now in OA mitigation efforts, especially as Grace showed that the impacts might not be seen until 2100 significantly. But that doesn't mean that they can't be engaged now and start getting prepared. So in general, stakeholder engagement in New Jersey will likely be a challenge because we haven't experienced any of those one standalone catastrophic events that Grace mentioned that happened along the West Coast, so those oyster hatchery failures. In that situation, it was a flashpoint where stakeholders that represented industry, academia, as well as policymakers were all actively engaged very quickly because it was such a catastrophic event. So outreach to stakeholders that helps some of the unengaged groups understand how ocean acidification may influence their quality of life or business in the future will be really helpful in this education effort. And many East Coast states, as I've mentioned before, are working on their own, or as Megan mentioned before, are working on their own OA initiatives, and they have encountered similar problems in terms of stakeholder engagement. So New Jersey can benefit from lessons learned from other states' experiences, and then as New Jersey goes through any future processes, they can share that as well with other states. And finally, engaging stakeholders helps to foster synergies and connections between stakeholder groups. So connecting stakeholder groups through the development of an OA initiative could create some good personal connections that could lead to collaboration opportunities. So maybe an oceanographer is sitting on an OA work group with a state's Department of Environmental Protection representative who is sharing some of the research needs that that state is lacking to actually make some policy decisions. What would be great is that oceanographer could then reach out to their network of scientists to see if anyone has an interest or the resources to fill those data gaps and really help the state move forward and make those decisions. So for these reasons and others, stakeholder engagement when developing and implementing an OA initiative is important. So now I'm going to transition into talking about some good examples of stakeholder engagement in states that have ongoing OA initiatives. First up is Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has an OA commission that was created by a state bill in 2018. The final product of the commission is to provide recommendations about OA to the state legislature so that the legislature could then act and make progress on OA. What I want to highlight about Massachusetts is that the 2018 bill specifically outlines the different stakeholder groups that would need to be represented on that commission. So that's incredible. And in addition to the representatives from state government that are required, the bill called for 2 representatives from an environmental or community group, 1 commercial fisherman with a shellfish aquaculture license like this farmer right here, 1 commercial fisherman that has a lobster permit, 1 commercial fisherman with a shellfish permit, and 3 scientists that have studied coastal or ocean acidification in the past. With this diversity of commission members, the group will be able to make robust recommendations through the lens of industry, science, and local politics and policies, which will be a really nice combination. So next up is New York. Courtesy of a 2016 piece of legislation, New York has an OA task force that's responsible for creating a report on OA for the state. And as part of that process, New York is required to hold 4 public meetings during the development of that OA report to engage the public and other stakeholders. So these public meetings are actually really well done in terms of content and structure. Each meeting includes presentations by expert scientists or policymakers about current efforts related to OA in the state, which is a great education opportunity for the public and other stakeholder groups. The picture to the right is actually a screenshot of one of the presentations that was done last year talking about different OA monitoring sites in Long Island. So those meetings also include discussion on drafts of the report and provide opportunities for the public to comment on those drafts. Unfortunately, those public meetings are not the best attended by the public, but the structure and the intent behind those meetings are meaningful and can definitely be applied in other states. So last but not least, I wanted to talk about Oregon. Oregon released an ocean acidification and hypoxia action plan last year, and it covers the years 2019 to 2025. As part of the plan, the state created some documents that help educate stakeholders on OA, and the documents are really polished. They have clear messaging, and most documents are less than 2 pages, so it would be really easy to print them out and share them with stakeholders. An example of one of the documents that I thought was really great are species spotlights. So the species spotlight intent is to provide information about the impacts of OA on some of the state's commercially important species like salmon and oysters. So the picture on the bottom left is actually a screenshot from the salmon species spotlight. And Oregon also has created several videos that are available on YouTube that explain the causes and impacts of OA on the state, as well as some solutions that they've thought of. And the image you see to the right is a screenshot from one of those videos where a hatchery manager is talking about how OA might impact his work. So from these two slides, what we've learned is that there is a range of good stakeholder engagement strategies. But as we all know, a key element of engaging stakeholders is being able to physically contact them. So that's where the project that I worked on this summer actually comes in. So I've been helping New Jersey prepare for their future OA stakeholder engagement process by compiling a comprehensive list of key stakeholders that would have an interest in New Jersey's development of an OA initiative. The list has stakeholder contact information, like their email addresses and other relevant information that would help New Jersey kind of sort them into different sectors if they wanted to do more targeted outreach. The purpose of the stakeholder list is to have a ready-made list that New Jersey DEP can reference for the rollout of any OA initiatives in the future and stakeholder engagement efforts. I've also tried to align the stakeholder list with the science report that both Megan and Grace mentioned earlier in this presentation. The report, like Megan said, had a section that talked about ocean acidification in New Jersey and highlights several groups that would be impacted. So I've tried to populate the stakeholder list with individuals and groups that align with what NJDEP published, but there are definitely more stakeholders beyond that. And I've pulled a few pictures out here to show you the range of stakeholder groups that we're including. So on the left, you'll see the seal for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. It's an interstate group that manages the 27 near-shore migratory fish species that span the Atlantic coast, some of which will need to be studied further, as Grace said, to actually understand the impacts of OA on their different life stages and within the populations themselves. That middle seal is for the New Jersey Restaurant and Hospitality Association. It's a group that tracks all the action in the state capital that may impact restaurants and their success as a business in the state. So this group would be worried about anything that impacts the supply of seafood to those restaurants and would therefore be interested in ocean acidification. Finally, I've included the seal for the Economic Development Board of Cumberland County, New Jersey. It's a county that was in that dark red area that Grace showed, hugging the Delaware Bay. So we know this area is socially vulnerable to climate change and would definitely be concerned about changes to fish and shellfish populations as a result of ocean acidification. So that's what I have to say about stakeholder engagement. This is a picture of me doing research on oysters in the Delaware Bay. And I have a slide that has sources in case anybody wanted to check anything out from what I talked about today.
Thank you, Janine. That was fantastic. I'm going to ask really quickly because we're short for time for all of our presenters. You were fantastic. Please turn your cameras and your audio on. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carrie Ferraro, my colleague who's been diligently monitoring the chat. She'll direct questions to our speakers, curated questions, and we are going to go about 5 minutes over because we did get started a little bit late due to technical difficulties. So Carrie, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Marjorie, and thank you to all of our presenters today. That was wonderful. We did get a number of questions, as Marjorie mentioned, but we'll only have time for a few. We had a number of questions that were about what's being done to reduce or reverse the rate of ocean acidification. For example, Ken Dolsky was interested in any actions that are being taken. And John Armstrong asked specifically about the Vesta project, which uses olivine rocks on beaches to both capture CO2 from the air and increase ocean pH, excuse me. And so whether you have thoughts about that project and the science behind it.
I'm not familiar specifically with what was it called? The Vesta project? Yeah, I'm not familiar specifically with that project. There are other mitigation projects that are ongoing and kind of they're trying to test it out. So things like even submerged aquatic vegetation restoration that might reduce pH and aragonite saturation state in coastal estuarine systems. So I know that there's mitigation efforts ongoing, and even oyster restoration efforts could help impact because they're basically filtering the water. So I know that there's mitigation efforts. I just don't know the scalability yet for those because they're still kind of figuring out local impacts. And the other question was, what actions I think are we taking to help mitigate OA? I think Megan might be able to talk a little bit more on this too, but I think the main one is nutrient reductions, setting nutrient limits for agriculture so that we can reduce any kind of like eutrophication events where we have all this excess nutrients coming in causing these big phytoplankton blooms, and in some cases harmful algal blooms that can really take the oxygen out of the system, but then also increase pH and CO2. So I do know that nutrient reduction is a big one, and that's a local thing we can do. Using less electricity, the offshore wind could be helpful, reducing our, and that's more local, but also goes to that global impact of how we can globally help, and that's reducing CO2 emissions. But that's an international effort to do that. So I know that there are some local things we can do, but also advocating for reductions in CO2 in everywhere else. I don't know if Megan has anything to add to that.
No, yeah, I would mainly agree that the biggest thing we could do is, as you said, to advocate for a reduction in anything that reduces CO2 is the greatest thing we can do to mitigate. I said at the state, we're just starting to specifically look at mitigating CO2 as it affects acidification. But
Hey, thank you both very much. So we also received a number of questions about the impacts of ocean acidification on organisms. Judy Weiss asked about whether, she said that there was a paper that came out last spring saying that species behavior was not affected by ocean acidification. And she was wondering what your thoughts were, considering that dozens of other papers published showed that there was a behavioral effect on species of fish.
Yeah, this is the beauty of science. Different methods can lead to different results. And what we know from all of the ocean acidification literature is that there is high variability of response between species, but also within a species. And it just depends on what conditions they're exposed to. So we're still learning a lot with respect to, what is their innate variability within the species, and then, what is a real response and what is, artificial. So there's still a lot to be learned through these studies. I think the study that was specifically mentioned, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Timothy Clark was the lead author of that. So they couldn't reproduce some of the earlier study results. So whether that's due to sample size or the way that they conducted the experiment, I can't remember specifically. But again, it just goes to that, that we don't really know everything, and we're probably never going to know everything. So it just advocates for why we need more studies and why we need improved experimental design to better understand what a real response is.
Great, thank you so much. So along these lines, Simi Payne asks, Dr. Saba, you provided an excellent description of how OA affects New Jersey's commercially exploited marine species. Can you comment on OA's impacts on non-commercial marine species and on New Jersey's marine ecosystems?
I can try. Yeah, I mean, so all of these species will fall under different taxonomic groups, right? So you have your shellfish, you have your finfish, sharks, and just because it's not a commercially important species doesn't mean it's not going to have similar impacts. So, and I talked a lot about shellfish, but when I did show that metadata review by Christy Croker, showing all the different processes being impacted, those were not just calcifying organisms. Those were finfish, all sorts of organisms that don't calcify. So in non-calcifying organisms, they can have physiological impacts as well that can impact their reproduction, because what's happening is all organisms in the ocean rely on ion exchange for their physiology. And so when there's an influx of those hydrogen ions, the organism has to respond to that and has to deal with where to put these different hydrogen ions and just how to handle that. So it might impact other processes. So that's why some of the things like reproduction and growth and metabolism might be impacted by ocean acidification. So, and that's going to be true for many organisms, not just the commercially important ones. And as far as New Jersey ecosystems, we have several different ecosystem types in New Jersey. We have our riverine ecosystems, we have estuarine ecosystems, and just within New Jersey, we have very dramatically different estuarine ecosystems. We have highly urbanized ecosystems like the Raritan Bay versus much less impacted estuarine ecosystems like the Great Bay in southern Jersey. But then we have pine barren impacts, and there's a lot of with the pine barrens and all of the tannins and organic material, we actually have low pH in some of those freshwater systems in southern New Jersey naturally because of the terrigenous material that's in there. So we can learn a lot from those ecosystems on how organisms are dealing with low pH. So that's kind of a natural low pH system that we can actually study. So because we have so many different ecosystems in New Jersey, it's hard to just give one straight answer because every type of ecosystem is probably going to respond differently. But I will say that we can learn a lot from those areas in southern New Jersey where we have natural kind of acidified conditions. So I don't know if that really answers her question, but.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, the other thing I can say is that a lot of the studies that we've seen that we measure responses are single species experiments done in a laboratory setting. And so how you can scale that up into an actual habitat in the ocean is still something we're working on as scientists to figure out how best to figure out how will they respond the exact same way that they respond in the lab. So that's why we can't really answer how a whole ecosystem is going to be impacted yet, because we can only gain so much information in a laboratory, and it's really hard to do these experiments in the field. So again, going back to better experimental design, kind of trying to figure out how to do experiments in the field or other proxies we can measure in the field that would inform how they're responding. So a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much. And I think we have time just for one more question. And this one kind of goes back to what we talked about with mitigation. So Stephen Schwander asked if the increased carbon dioxide input actually starts to go down, or so if we start to decrease carbon dioxide inputs, do you have a sense of how long it would take the system to rebound and normalize again? So basically, how long will it take the ocean to recover? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you can reference the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, They discuss that a lot. And what it seems like, because they have the models going into the future with all these different scenarios for CO2 reduction. So from we don't do anything at all to curb CO2 emissions to maximum, curbing. So a lot of clean energy, no CO2 emissions. So there's a range of scenarios, but even on that range where we do the maximal amount to lower CO2 emissions, it still takes decades to get back to where we're at now. So it's a long process, and that's has a lot to do with the ocean, because the ocean absorbs the carbon dioxide and then it can get sequestered into the deep ocean, and this water circulates through the entire ocean around the globe before it's actually eventually released back into the atmosphere. So it's a very complex interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean with that CO2 exchange and that process. So it takes a long time for the Earth to level out once we make a big change like that.
Thank you so much, Grace. This is Marjorie. We're very lucky that our colleague Jean Herb was able to join us from her vacation, and we've unmuted her, and she can chime in to answer a question that came on a little bit earlier. She and I have been exchanging messages. So Jean, if you can hear us, why don't you chime in to address the question? I think it had related to what Janine was asked.
Yeah, I guess all I wanted to add, Marjorie, was that we should probably point participants to the state's recent science report on climate change, which has a fairly lengthy discussion about ocean acidification, and also outlines some options here in New Jersey. So I think between that and some of the work that the state's doing now in terms of looking at opportunities for mitigation, whether that's work regionally, with other states, nationally, or locally, here just even in New Jersey, that report provides a lot of ideas in terms of directions that the state might be headed. So I think this is an area where we're going to see a lot more discussion in terms of policy options in New Jersey.
Yes, and you may not have been on at the very, very beginning, but Megan did a good job of showing folks know about it. So thanks for reinforcing that. So I think that folks will go to it. So Megan, congratulations again on your report and for all the work everybody's been doing to put this together. So I think that we kind of have gone over on our time, but I really want to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be sending out a link to the recording as soon as it's available. Your questions and comments in the chat have been extremely helpful. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar. In this series, will be Monday, August 17th at noon on climate adaptation planning for New Jersey's urban and natural forests with Patricia Leopold from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and Rick Lathrop from Rutgers University. And that concludes today's event. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thanks for our presenters, and be well, everyone. Thank you.